Chapter 21 of Mr. Standfast by John Buchan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21, How an Exile Returned to His Own People. Next morning I found the army commander on his way to Doulon. "Take over the division?" he said. "Certainly. I'm afraid there isn't much left of it. I'll tell Carr to get through to the Corps headquarters when he can find them. You'll have to nurse the remnants, for they can't be pulled out yet, not for a day or two. Bless me, Hannay, there are parts of our line which we're holding with a man and a boy. You've got to stick it out till the French take over. We're not hanging on by our eyelids, it's our eyelashes now." "What about positions to fall back on, sir?" I asked. "We're doing our best, but we haven't enough men to prepare them." He plucked open a map. "There we're digging a line, and there. If we can hold that bit for 2 days, we shall have a fair line resting on the river, but we mayn't have time." Then I told him about Blenkiron, whom of course he had heard of. "He was one of the biggest engineers in the States, and he's got a nailing fine eye for country. He'll make good somehow if you let him help in the job." "The very fellow," he said, and he wrote an order. "Take this to Jacks, and he'll fix up a temporary commission. Your man can find a uniform somewhere in Amiens." After that I went to the detail camp and found that Ivery had duly arrived. "The prisoner has given no trouble, sir," Hamilton reported, "but he's a wee thing peevish. They're saying that the Germans is getting on fine, and I was telling him that he should be proud of his ain folk. But he wasn't verra weel pleased." 3 days had wrought a transformation in Ivery. That face, once so cool and capable, was now sharpened like a hunted beast's. His imagination was preying on him, and I could picture its torture. He, who had been always at the top directing the machine, was now only a cog in it. He had never in his life been anything but powerful. Now he was impotent. He was in a hard, unfamiliar world, in the grip of something which he feared and didn't understand, in the charge of men who were in no way amenable to his persuasiveness. It was like a proud and bullying manager suddenly forced to labour in a squad of navvies, and worse, for there was the gnawing physical fear of what was coming. He made an appeal to me. "Do the English torture their prisoners?" he asked. "You have beaten me, I own it, and I plead for mercy. I will go on my knees if you like. I am not afraid of death, in my own way." Few people are afraid of death in their own way. "Why do you degrade me? I am a gentleman." "Not as we define the thing," I said. His jaw dropped. "What are you going to do with me?" he quavered. "You have been a soldier," I said. "You are going to see a little fighting from the ranks. There will be no brutality. You will be armed if you want to defend yourself. You will have the same chance of survival as the men around you. You may have heard that your countrymen are doing well. It is even possible that they may win the battle. What was your forecast to me? Amiens in 2 days, Abbeville in 3? Well, you are a little behind scheduled time, but still you are prospering. You told me that you were the chief architect of all this, and you are going to be given the chance of seeing it, perhaps of sharing in it, from the other side. Does it not appeal to your sense of justice?" He groaned and turned away. I had no more pity for him than I would have had for a black mamba that had killed my friend and was now caught to a cleft tree. Nor, oddly enough, had Wake. If we had shot Ivery outright at St. Anton, I am certain that Wake would have called us murderers. Now he was in complete agreement. His passionate hatred of war made him rejoice that a chief contriver of war should be made to share in its terrors. "He tried to talk me over this morning," he told me, "claimed he was on my side, and said the kind of thing I used to say last year. It made me rather ashamed of some of my past performances to hear that scoundrel imitating them. By the way, Hannay, what are you going to do with me?" "You're coming on my staff. You're a stout fellow, and I can't do without you." "Remember, I won't fight." "You won't be asked to. We're trying to stem the tide which wants to roll to the sea. You know how the Boche behaves in occupied country, and Mary's in Amiens." At that news he shut his lips. "Still," he began. "Still," I said, "I don't ask you to forfeit one of your blessed principles. You needn't fire a shot. But I want a man to carry orders for me, for we haven't a line any more, only a lot of blobs like Quicksilver. I want a clever man for the job, and a brave one, and I know that you're not afraid." "No," he said, "I don't think I am much. Well, I'm content." I started Blenkiron off in a car for Corps Headquarters, and in the afternoon took the road myself. I knew every inch of the country, the lift of the hill east of Amiens, the Roman highway that ran straight as an arrow to Saint-Quentin, the marshy lagoons of the Somme, and that broad strip of land wasted by battle between Dompierre and Péronne. I had come to Amiens through it in January, for I had been up to the line before I left for Paris, and then it had been a peaceful place, with peasants tilling their fields, and new buildings going up on the old battlefield, and carpenters busy at cottage roofs, and scarcely a transport wagon on the road to remind one of war. Now the main route was choked like the Albert road when the Somme battle first began, troops going up and troops coming down, the latter in the last stage of weariness, a ceaseless traffic of ambulances one way and ammunition wagons the other, busy staff cars trying to worm a way through the mass, strings of gun horses, oddments of cavalry, and here and there blue French uniforms. All that I had seen before, but one thing was new to me. Little country carts with sad-faced women and mystified children in them, and piles of household plenishing were creeping westward, or stood waiting at village doors. Beside these tramped old men and boys, mostly in their Sunday best, as if they were going to church. I had never seen the sight before, for I had never seen the British Army falling back. The dam which held up the waters had broken, and the dwellers in the valley were trying to save their pitiful little treasures. And over everything, horse and man, cart and wheelbarrow, road and tillage, lay the white March dust. The sky was as blue as June, small birds were busy in the copses, and in the corners of abandoned gardens I had a glimpse of the first violets. Presently, as we topped a rise, we came within full noise of the guns. That, too, was new to me, for it was no ordinary bombardment. There was a special quality in the sound, something ragged, straggling, intermittent, which I had never heard before. It was the sign of open warfare and a moving battle. At Péronne, from which the newly returned inhabitants had a second time fled, the battle seemed to be at the doors. There I had news of my division. It was farther south, towards Saint-Christ. We groped our way among bad roads to where its headquarters were believed to be, while the voice of the guns grew louder. They turned out to be those of another division, which was busy getting ready to cross the river. Then the dark fell, and while airplanes flew west into the sunset, there was a redder sunset in the east, where the unceasing flashes of gunfire were pale against the angry glow of burning dumps. The sight of the bonnet badge of a Scots Fusilier made me halt, and the man turned out to belong to my division. Half an hour later I was taking over from the much-relieved Masterton in the ruins of what had once been a sugar-beet factory. There, to my surprise, I found Lefroy. The Boche had held him prisoner for precisely 8 hours. During that time he had been so interested in watching the way the enemy handled an attack that he had forgotten the miseries of his position. He described with blasphemous admiration the endless wheel by which supplies and reserve troops move up, the silence, the smoothness, the perfect discipline. Then he realized that he was a captive and unwounded, and had gone mad. Being a heavyweight boxer of note, he had sent his 2 guards spinning into a ditch, dodged the ensuing shots, and found shelter in the lee of a blazing ammunition dump where his pursuers hesitated to follow. Then he had spent an anxious hour trying to get through an outpost line, which he thought was Boche. Only by overhearing an exchange of oaths in the accents of Dundee did he realize that it was our own. It was a comfort to have Lefroy back, for he was both stout-hearted and resourceful. but I found that I had a division only on paper. It was about the strength of a brigade, the brigades battalions, and the battalions companies. This is not the place to write the story of the week that followed. I could not write it even if I wanted to, for I don't know it. There was a plan somewhere, which you will find in the history books, but with me it was blank chaos. Orders came, but long before they arrived the situation had changed, and I could no more obey them than fly to the moon. Often I had lost touch with the divisions on both flanks. Intelligence arrived erratically out of the void, and for the most part we worried along without it. I heard we were under the French. First it was said to be Foch, and then Fayolle, whom I had met in Paris. But the higher command seemed 1,000,000 miles away, and we were left to use our mother wits. My problem was to give ground as slowly as possible, and at the same time not to delay too long, for retreat we must, with the Boche sending in brand new divisions each morning. It was a kind of war worlds distant from the old trench battles, and since I had been taught no other, I had to invent rules as I went along. Looking back, it seems a miracle that any of us came out of it. Only the grace of God and the uncommon toughness of the British soldier bluffed the Hun and prevented him pouring through the breach to Abbeville and the sea. We were no better than a mosquito curtain stuck in a doorway to stop the advance of an angry bull. The army commander was right. We were hanging on with our eyelashes. We must have been easily the weakest part of the whole front, for we were holding a line which was never less than 2 miles, and was often, as I judged, nearer 5, and there was nothing in reserve to us except some oddments of cavalry who chased about the whole battlefield under vague orders. Mercifully for us, the Boche blundered. Perhaps he did not know our condition, for our airmen were magnificent, and you never saw a Boche plane over our line by day, though they bombed us merrily by night. If he had called our bluff, we should have been done, but he put his main strength to the north and the south of us. North he pressed hard on the Third Army, but he got well hammered by the Guards north of Bapaume, and he could make no headway at Arras. South he drove at the Paris railway and down the Oise valley, but there Pétain's reserves had arrived, and the French made a noble stand. Not that he didn't fight hard in the centre where we were, but he hadn't his best troops, and after we got west of the bend of the Somme he was outrunning his heavy guns. Still, it was a desperate enough business, for our flanks were all the time falling back, and we had to conform to movements we could only guess at. After all, we were on the direct route to Amiens, and it was up to us to yield slowly so as to give Haig and Pétain time to get up supports. I was a miser about every yard of ground, for every yard and every minute were precious. We alone stood between the enemy and the city, and in the city was Mary. If you ask me about our plans, I can't tell you. I had a new one every hour. I got instructions from the Corps, but as I have said, they were usually out of date before they arrived, and most of my tactics I had to invent myself. I had a plain task, and to fulfill it I had to use what methods the Almighty allowed me. I hardly slept, I ate little, I was on the move day and night, but I never felt so strong in my life. It seemed as if I couldn't tire, and oddly enough I was happy. If a man's whole being is focused on one aim, he has no time to worry. I remember we were all very gentle and soft-spoken those days. Lefroy, whose tongue was famous for its edge, now cooed like a dove. The troops were on their uppers, but as steady as rocks. We were against the end of the world, and that stiffens a man. Day after day saw the same performance. I held my wavering front with an outpost line which delayed each new attack till I could take its bearings. I had special companies for counter-attack at selected points when I wanted time to retire the rest of the division. I think we must have fought more than a dozen of such little battles. We lost men all the time, but the enemy made no big scoop, though he was always on the edge of one. Looking back, it seems like a succession of miracles. Often I was in one end of a village when the Boche was in the other. Our batteries were always on the move, and the work of the gunners was past praising. Sometimes we faced east, sometimes north, and once at a most critical moment due south, for our front waved and blew like a flag at a masthead. Thank God the enemy was getting away from his big engine, and his ordinary troops were fagged and poor in quality. It was when his fresh shock battalions came on that I held my breath. He had a heathenish amount of machine guns, and he used them beautifully. Oh, I take my hat off to the Boche performance. He was doing what we had tried to do at the Somme and the Aisne and Arras and Ypres, and he was more or less succeeding. And the reason was that he was going bald-headed for victory. The men, as I have said, were wonderfully steady and patient under the fiercest trials that soldiers can endure. I had all kinds in the division, old army, new army, territorials, and you couldn't pick and choose between them. They fought like Trojans, and dirty, weary, and hungry, found still some salt of humour in their sufferings. It was a proof of the rock-bottom sanity of human nature, but we had one man with us who was hardly sane. In the hustle of those days I now and then caught sight of Ivory. I had to be everywhere at all hours, and often visited that remnant of Scots Fusiliers into which the supplest brain in Europe had been drafted. He and his keepers were never on outpost duty or in any counter-attack. They were part of the mass whose only business was to retire discreetly. This was child's play to Hamilton, who had been out since Mons, and Amos, after taking a day to get used to it, wrapped himself in his grim philosophy and rather enjoyed it. You couldn't surprise Amos any more than a Turk. But the man with them, whom they never left, that was another matter. For the first wee bit, Hamilton reported, we thought he was gone daft. Every shell that came near he jumped like a young horse. And the gas, we had to tie on his mask for him, for his hands were fushionless. There was whiles that he wasn't be hindered from standing up and talking to hisself, though the bullets was spittin'. He was what ye call demoralized. Syne he got as though he didna hear or see onything. He did what we telled him, and when we let him be, he sat down and grat. He's aye greetin', "Queer thing, sir, but the Germans canna hit him. I'm aye shaking bullets out of my claes, and I got a hole in my shoulder, and Andrew took a bash on his tin that would have felled anybody that hadn't a head like a stot. But, sir, the prisoner takes no scathe. Our boys have feared of him. There was an Irishman says to me that he had the evil eye, and ye can see for yourself that he's no canny." I saw that his skin had become like parchment, and that his eyes were glassy. I don't think he recognized me. "Does he take his meals?" I asked. "He doesn't eat muckle, but he has an unco thirst. You canna keep him off the men's water bottles." He was learning very fast the meaning of that war he had so confidently played with. I believe I am a merciful man, but as I looked at him I felt no vestige of pity. He was dreeing the weird he had prepared for others. I thought of Scudder, of the 1,000 friends I had lost, of the great seas of blood and the mountains of sorrow this man and his like had made for the world. Out of the corner of my eye I could see the long ridges above Comble and Longueval, which the salt of the earth had fallen to win, and which were again under the hoof of the Boche. I thought of the distracted city behind us, and what it meant to me, and the weak, the pitifully weak screen which was all its defence. I thought of the foul deeds which had made the German name to stink by land and sea, foulness of which he was the arch-begetter. And then I was amazed at our forbearance. He would go mad, and madness for him was more decent than sanity. I had another man who wasn't what you might call normal, and that was Wake. He was the opposite of shell-shocked, if you understand me. He had never been properly under fire before, but he didn't give a straw for it. I had known the same thing with other men, and they generally ended by crumpling up, for it isn't natural that 5 or 6 feet of human flesh shouldn't be afraid of what can torture and destroy it. The natural thing is to be always a little scared, like me, but by an effort of the will and attention to work to contrive to forget it. But Wake apparently never gave it a thought. He wasn't foolhardy, only indifferent. He used to go about with a smile on his face, a smile of contentment. Even the horrors, and we had plenty of them, didn't affect him. His eyes, which used to be hot, had now a curious open innocence like Peter's. I would have been happier if he had been a little rattled. One night, after we had had a bad day of anxiety, I talked to him as we smoked in what had once been a French dugout. He was an extra right arm to me, and I told him so. "This must be a queer experience for you," I said. "Yes," he replied, "it is very wonderful. I did not think a man could go through it and keep his reason. But I know many things I did not know before. I know that the soul can be reborn without leaving the body." I stared at him, and he went on without looking at me. "You're not a classical scholar, Hannay? There was a strange cult in the ancient world, the worship of Magna Mater, the Great Mother. To enter into her mysteries, the votary passed through a bath of blood. I think I am passing through that bath. I think that, like the initiate, I shall be renatus in aeternum, reborn into the eternal." I advised him to have a drink, for that talk frightened me. It looked as if he were becoming what the Scots call fey. Lefroy noticed the same thing, and was always speaking about it. He was as brave as a bull himself, and with very much the same kind of courage, but Wake's gallantry perturbed him. "I can't make the chap out," he told me. "He behaves as if his mind was too full of better things to give a damn for Boche guns. He doesn't take foolish risks, I don't mean that, but he behaves as if risks didn't signify. It's positively eerie to see him making notes with a steady hand when shells are dropping like hailstones and we're all thinking every minute's our last. You've got to be careful with him, sir. He's a long sight too valuable for us to spare." Lefroy was right about that, for I don't know what I should have done without him. The worst part of our job was to keep touch with our flanks, and that was what I used Wake for. He covered country like a moss trooper, sometimes on a rusty bicycle, oftener on foot, and you couldn't tire him. I wonder what other divisions thought of the grimy private who was our chief means of communication. He knew nothing of military affairs before, but he got the hang of this rough-and-tumble fighting as if he had been born for it. He never fired a shot. He carried no arms. The only weapons he used were his brains, and they were the best conceivable. I never met a staff officer who was so quick at getting a point or at sizing up a situation. He had put his back into the business, and first-class talent is not common anywhere. One day a GSO from a neighboring division came to see me. "Where on earth did you pick up that man Wake?" he asked. "He's a conscientious objector and a non-combatant," I said. "Then I wish to heaven we had a few more conscientious objectors in this show. He's the only fellow who seems to know anything about this blessed battle. My general's sending you a chit about him." "No need," I said, laughing. "I know his value. He's an old friend of mine." I used Wake as my link with Corps Headquarters, and especially with Blenkiron. For about the 6th day of the show I was beginning to get rather desperate. This kind of thing couldn't go on for ever. We were miles back now, behind the old line of 17, and, as we rested one flank on the river, the immediate situation was a little easier. But I had lost a lot of men, and those that were left were blind with fatigue. The big bulges of the enemy to north and south had added to the length of the total front, and I found I had to fan out my thin ranks. The Boche was still pressing on, though his impetus was slacker. If he knew how little there was to stop him in my section, he might make a push which would carry him to Amiens. Only the magnificent work of our airmen had prevented him from getting that knowledge, but we couldn't keep the secrecy up for ever. Some day an enemy plane would get over, and it only needed the drive of a fresh storm battalion or two to scatter us. I wanted a good prepared position, with sound trenches and decent wiring. Above all, I wanted reserves. Reserves. The word was on my lips all day, and it haunted my dreams. I was told that the French were to relieve us, but when? When? My reports to Corps Headquarters were one long wail for more troops. I knew there was a position prepared behind us, but I needed men to hold it. Wake brought in a message from Blenkiron. "We're waiting for you, Dick," he wrote, "and we've gotten quite a nice little home ready for you. The old man hasn't hustled so hard since he struck copper in Montana in '92. We've dug 3 lines of trenches and made a heap of pretty redoubts, and I guess they're well laid out, for the Army staff has supervised them, and they're no slouches at this brand of engineering. You would have laughed to see the labor we employed. We had all breeds of Dago and Chinamen, and some of your own South African blacks, and they got so busy on the job they forgot about bedtime. I used to be reckoned a bit of a slave driver, but my special talents weren't needed with this push. I'm going to put a lot of money into foreign missions henceforward." I wrote back, "Your trenches are no good without men. For God's sake get something that can hold a rifle. My lot are done to the world." Then I left Lefroy with the division and went down on the back of an ambulance to see for myself. I found Blenkiron, some of the Army engineers, and a staff officer from Corps Headquarters, and I found Archie Roylance. They had dug a mighty good line and wired it nobly. It ran from the river to the wood of La Bruyere, on the little hill above the Ablain stream. It was desperately long, but I saw at once it couldn't well be shorter, for the division on the south of us had its hands full with the fringe of the big thrust against the French. "It's no good blinking the facts," I told them. "I haven't 1,000 men, and what I have are at the end of their tether. If you put 'em in these trenches, they'll go to sleep on their feet. When can the French take over?" I was told that it had been arranged for next morning, but that it had now been put off 24 hours. It was only a temporary measure, pending the arrival of British divisions from the north. Archie looked grave. "The Boche is pushing up new troops in this sector. We got the news before I left squadron headquarters. It looks as if it would be a near thing, sir." "It won't be a near thing. It's an absolute black certainty. My fellows can't carry on as they are another day. Great God, they've had a fortnight in hell. Find me more men, or we buckle up at the next push." My temper was coming very near its limits. "We've raked the country with a small-tooth comb, sir," said one of the staff officers, "and we've raised a scratch pack, best part of 2,000. Good men, but most of them know nothing about infantry fighting. We've put them into platoons and done our best to give them some kind of training. There's one thing may cheer you. We've plenty of machine guns. There's a machine gun school nearby, and we got all the men who were taking the course and all the plant." I don't suppose there was ever such a force put into the field before. It was a wilder medley than Moussy's camp followers at First Ypres. There was every kind of detail in the shape of men returning from leave, representing most of the regiments in the army. There were the men from the machine-gun school. There were corps troops, sappers and ASC, and a handful of corps cavalry. Above all, there was a batch of American engineers, fathered by Blenkiron. I inspected them where they were drilling and liked the look of them. 48 hours, I said to myself. With luck, we may just pull it off. Then I borrowed a bicycle and went back to the division. But before I left, I had a word with Archie. "This is one big game of bluff, and it's you fellows alone that enable us to play it. Tell your people that everything depends on them. They mustn't stint the planes in this sector, for if the Boche once suspicions how little he's got before him, the game's up. He's not a fool, and he knows that this is the shortest road to Amiens, but he imagines we're holding it in strength. If we keep up the fiction for another 2 days, the thing's done. You say he's pushing up troops?" "Yes, and he's sending forward his tanks." "Well, that'll take time. He's slower now than a week ago, and he's got a deuce of a country to march over. There's still an outside chance we may win through. You go home and tell the RFC what I've told you." He nodded. "By the way, sir, Pienaar's with the squadron. He would like to come up and see you." "Archie," I said solemnly, "be a good chap and do me a favour. If I think Peter's anywhere near the line I'll go off my head with worry. This is no place for a man with a bad leg. He should have been in England days ago. Can't you get him off to Amiens anyhow?" "We scarcely like to. You see, we're all desperately sorry for him, his fun gone and his career over and all that. He likes being with us and listening to our yarns. He has been up once or twice, too. The shark Gladys. He swears it's a great make, and certainly he knows how to handle the little devil." "Then for heaven's sake don't let him do it again. I look to you, Archie. Remember. Promise." "Funny thing, but he's always worrying about you. He has a map on which he marks every day the changes in position, and he'd hobble a mile to pump any of our fellows who've been up your way." That night, under cover of darkness, I drew back the division to the newly prepared lines. We got away easily, for the enemy was busy with his own affairs. I suspected a relief by fresh troops. There was no time to lose, and I can tell you I toiled to get things straight before dawn. I would have liked to send my own fellows back to rest, but I couldn't spare them yet. I wanted them to stiffen the fresh lot, for they were veterans. The new position was arranged on the same principles as the old front, which had been broken on March 21st. There was our forward zone, consisting of an outpost line and redoubts, very cleverly sited with a line of resistance. Well behind it were the trenches which formed the battle zone. Both zones were heavily wired, and we had plenty of machine guns. I wish I could say we had plenty of men who knew how to use them. The outposts were merely to give the alarm and fall back to the line of resistance, which was to hold out to the last. In the forward zone I put the freshest of my own men, the units being brought up to something like strength by the details returning from leave that the Corps had commandeered. With them I put the American engineers, partly in the redoubts and partly in companies for counter-attack. Blenkiron had reported that they could shoot like Dan'l Boone and were simply spoiling for a fight. The rest of the force was in the battle zone, which was our last hope. If that went, the Boche had a clear walk to Amiens. Some additional field batteries had been brought up to support our very weak divisional artillery. The front was so long that I had to put all three of my emaciated brigades in the line, so I had nothing to speak of in reserve. It was a most almighty gamble. We had found shelter just in time. At 6:30 next day, for a change, it was a clear morning with clouds beginning to bank up from the west. The Boche let us know he was alive. He gave us a good drenching with gas shells, which didn't do much harm, and then messed up our forward zone with his trench mortars. At 7:20 his men began to come on, first little bunches with machine guns, and then the infantry in waves. It was clear they were fresh troops, and we learned afterwards from prisoners that they were Bavarians, 6th or 7th, I forget which, but the division that hung us up at Monchy. At the same time there was the sound of a tremendous bombardment across the river. It looked as if the main battle had swung from Albert and Montdidier to a direct push for Amiens. I have often tried to write down the events of that day. I tried it in my report to the Corps. I tried it in my own diary. I tried it because Mary wanted it, but I have never been able to make any story that hung together. Perhaps I was too tired for my mind to retain clear impressions, though at the time I was not conscious of special fatigue. More likely it is because the fight itself was so confused, for nothing happened according to the books, and the orderly soul of the Boche must have been scarified. At first it went as I expected. The outpost line was pushed in, but the fire from the redoubts broke up the advance and enabled the line of resistance in the forward zone to give a good account of itself. There was a check, and then another big wave, assisted by a barrage from field guns brought far forward. This time the line of resistance gave at several points, and Lefroy flung in the Americans in a counter-attack. That was a mighty performance. The engineers, yelling like dervishes, went at it with a bayonet, and those that preferred swung their rifles as clubs. It was terribly costly fighting, and all wrong, but it succeeded. They cleared the Boche out of a ruined farm he had rushed, and a little wood, and we established our front. Blenkiron, who saw it all, for he went with them and got the tip of an ear picked off by a machine-gun bullet, hadn't any words wherewith to speak of it. "And I once said those boys looked puffy," he moaned. The next phase, which came about midday, was the tanks. I had never seen the German variety, but had heard that it was speedier and heavier than ours, but unwieldy. We did not see much of their speed, but we found out all about their clumsiness. Had the things been properly handled, they should have gone through us like rotten wood. But the whole outfit was bungled. It looked good enough country for the use of them, but the men who made our positions had had an eye to this possibility. The great monsters, mounting a field gun besides other contrivances, wanted something like a high road to be happy in. They were useless over anything like difficult ground. The ones that came down the main road got on well enough at the start, but Blenkiron very sensibly had mined the highway, and we blew a hole like a diamond pit. One lay helpless at the foot of it, and we took the crew prisoner. Another stuck its nose over and remained there till our field guns got the range and knocked it silly. As for the rest, there is a marshy lagoon called the Patte d'Oie beside the farm of Gavrelle, which runs all the way north to the river, though in most places it only seems like a soft patch in the meadows. This the tanks had to cross to reach our line, and they never made it. Most got bogged and made pretty targets for our gunners. One or two returned, and one, the Americans, creeping forward under cover of a little stream, blew up with the time fuse. By the middle of the afternoon I was feeling happier. I knew the big attack was still to come, but I had my forward zone intact, and I hoped for the best. I remember I was talking to Wake, who had been going between the two zones, when I got the first warning of a new and unexpected peril. A dud shell plumped down a few yards from me. "Those fools across the river are firing short and badly off the straight," I said. Wake examined the shell. "No, it's a German one," he said. Then came others, and there could be no mistake about the direction, followed by a burst of machine-gun fire from the same quarter. We ran in cover to a point from which we could see the north bank of the river, and I got my glass on it. There was a lift of land from behind which the fire was coming. We looked at each other, and the same conviction stood in both faces. The Boche had pushed down the northern bank, and we were no longer in line with our neighbours. The enemy was in a situation to catch us with his fire on our flank and left rear. We couldn't retire to conform, for to retire meant giving up our prepared position. It was the last straw to all our anxieties, and for a moment I was at the end of my wits. I turned to Wake, and his calm eyes pulled me together. "If they can't retake that ground, we're fairly carted," I said. "We are. Therefore they must retake it." "I must get on to Mitchinson." But as I spoke I realized the futility of a telephone message to a man who was pretty hard up against it himself. Only an urgent appeal could effect anything. I must go myself. No, that was impossible. I must send Lefroy, but he couldn't be spared. And all my staff officers were up to their necks in the battle. Besides, none of them knew the position as I knew it. And how to get there? It was a long way round by the bridge at Loisy. Suddenly I was aware of Wake's voice. "You had better send me," he was saying. "There's only one way, to swim the river a little lower down." "That's too damnably dangerous. I won't send any man to certain death." "But I volunteer," he said. "That, I believe, is always allowed in war." "But you'll be killed before you can cross." "Send a man with me to watch. If I get over, you may be sure I'll get to General Mitchinson. If not, send somebody else by Loisy. There's desperate need for hurry, and you see yourself it's the only way." The time was past for argument. I scribbled a line to Mitchinson as his credentials. No more was needed, for Wake knew the possession as well as I did. I sent an orderly to accompany him to his starting place on the bank. "Good-bye," he said, as we shook hands. "You'll see. I'll come back all right." His face, I remember, looked singularly happy. 5 minutes later the Boche guns opened for the final attack. I believe I kept a cool head, at least so Lefroy and the others reported. They said I went about all afternoon grinning as if I liked it, and that I never raised my voice once. It's rather a fault of mine that I bellow in a scrap. But I know I was feeling anything but calm, for the problem was ghastly. It all depended on Wake and Mitchinson. The flanking fire was so bad that I had to give up the left of the forward zone, which caught it fairly, and retire the men there to the battle zone. The latter was better protected, for between it and the river was a small wood, and the bank rose into a bluff which sloped inwards towards us. This withdrawal meant a switch, and a switch isn't a pretty thing when it has to be improvised in the middle of a battle. The Boche had counted on that flanking fire. His plan was to break our two wings, the old Boche plan which crops up in every fight. He left our centre at first pretty well alone, and thrust along the river bank and to the wood of La Bruyere, where we linked up with the division on our right. Lefroy was in the first area, and Masterton in the second, and for 3 hours it was as desperate a business as I have ever faced. The improvised switch went, and more of the forward zone disappeared. It was a hot, clear spring afternoon, and in the open fighting the enemy came on like troops at manoeuvres. On the left they got into the battle zone, and I can see yet Lefroy's great figure leading a counter-attack in person, his face all puddled with blood from a scalp wound. I would have given my soul to be in two places at once, but I had to risk our left and keep close to Masterton, who needed me most. The wood of La Bruyere was the maddest sight. Again and again the Boche was almost through it. You never knew where he was, and most of the fighting there was duels between machine-gun parties. Some of the enemy got around behind us, and only a fine performance of a company of Cheshires saved a complete breakthrough. As for Lefroy, I don't know how he stuck it out, and he doesn't know himself, for he was galled all the time by that accursed flanking fire. I got a note about 4:30 saying that Wake had crossed the river, but it was some weary hours after that before the fire slackened. I tore back and forward between my wings, and every time I went north I expected to find that Lefroy had broken. But by some miracle he held. The Boche were in his battle zone time and time again, but he always flung them out. I have a recollection of Blenkiron, stark mad, encouraging his Americans with strange tongues. Once as I passed him I saw that he had his left arm tied up. His blackened face grinned at me. "This bit of landscape's mighty unsafe for democracy," he croaked. "For the love of Mike, get your guns onto those devils across the river. They're plaguing my boys too bad." It was about 7 o'clock, I think, when the flanking fire slacked off, but it was not because of our divisional guns. There was a short and very furious burst of artillery fire on the north bank, and I knew it was British. Then things began to happen. One of our planes, they had been marvellous all day, swinging down like hawks for machine-gun bouts with the Boche infantry, reported that Mitchinson was attacking hard and getting on well. That eased my mind, and I started off for Masterton, who was in greater straits than ever, for the enemy seemed to be weakening on the river bank and putting his main strength in against our right. But my GSO-2 stopped me on the road. "Wake," he said, "he wants to see you." "Not now," I cried. "He can't live many minutes." I turned and followed him to the ruinous cowshed, which was my divisional headquarters. Wake, as I heard later, had swum the river opposite to Mitchinson's right and reached the other shore safely, though the current was whipped with bullets. But he had scarcely landed before he was badly hit by shrapnel in the groin. Walking at first with support and then carried on a stretcher, he managed to struggle on to the divisional headquarters, where he gave my message and explained the situation. He would not let his wound be looked to till his job was done. Mitchinson told me afterwards that with a face grey from pain he drew for him a sketch of our position and told him exactly how near we were to our end. After that he asked to be sent back to me, and they got him down to Loisy in a crowded ambulance, and then up to us in a returning empty. The M.O. who looked at his wound saw that the thing was hopeless, and did not expect him to live beyond Loisy. He was bleeding internally, and no surgeon on earth could have saved him. When he reached us he was almost pulseless, but he recovered for a moment and asked for me. I found him, with blue lips and a face drained of blood, lying on my camp bed. His voice was very small and far away. "How goes it?" he asked. "Please God, we'll pull through, thanks to you, old man." "Good," he said, and his eyes shut. He opened them again. "Funny thing, life. A year ago I was preaching peace. I'm still preaching it. I'm not sorry." I held his hand till 2 minutes later he died. In the press of a fight one scarcely realizes death, even the death of a friend. It was up to me to make good my assurance to Wake, and presently I was off to Masterton. There, in that shambles of La Bruyere, while the light faded, there was a desperate and most bloody struggle. It was the last lap of the contest. 12 hours now, I kept telling myself, and the French will be here and will have done our task. Alas, how many of us would go back to rest? Hardly able to totter, our counter-attacking companies went in again. They had gone far beyond the limits of mortal endurance, but the human spirit can defy all natural laws. The balance trembled, hung, and then dropped the right way. The enemy impetus weakened, stopped, and the ebb began. I wanted to complete the job. Our artillery put up a sharp barrage, and the little I had left comparatively fresh I sent in for a counterstroke. Most of the men were untrained, but there was that in our ranks which dispensed with training, and we had caught the enemy at the moment of lowest vitality. We pushed him out of La Bruyere, we pushed him back to our old forward zone, we pushed him out of that zone to the position from which he had begun the day. But there was no rest for the weary. We had lost at least a third of our strength, and we had to man the same long line. We consolidated it as best we could, started to replace the wiring that had been destroyed, found touch with the division on our right, and established outposts. Then after a conference with my brigadiers I went back to my headquarters, too tired to feel either satisfaction or anxiety. In 8 hours the French would be here. The words made a kind of litany in my ears. In the cowshed where Wake had lain, 2 figures awaited me. The talc-enclosed candle revealed Hamilton and Amos, dirty beyond words, smoke-blackened, blood-stained, and intricately bandaged. They stood stiffly to attention. "Sir, the prisoner," said Hamilton. "I have to report that the prisoner is dead." I stared at them, for I had forgotten Ivory. He seemed a creature of a world that had passed away. "Sir, it was like this. Ever since this morning the prisoner seemed to wake up. Ye'll mind that he was in a kind of a dream all week. But he got some new notions in his head, and when the battle began he exhibited signs of restlessness. Whilst he would lie down in the trench, and whilst he was wanted back to the dugout. According to instructions I provided him with a rifle, but he didn't seem to ken how to handle it. It was your orders, sir, that he was to have means to defend hisself if the enemy came on, so Amos gived him a trench knife. But very soon he looked as if he was ettlin' to cut his throat, so I deprived him of it." Hamilton stopped for breath. He spoke as if he were reciting a lesson, with no stops between the sentences. "I jaloused, sir, that he wouldna last oot the day, and Amos here was of the same opinion. The end came at 20 minutes past 3. I kenned the time, for I had just compared my watch with Amos. You'll mind that the Germans were beginning a big attack. We were in the front trench, or what they call the battle zone, and Amos and me was keeping our eyes on the enemy, who could be observed dribbling over the open. Just then the prisoner catches sight of the enemy and jumps up on top. Amos tried to hold him, but he kicked him in the face. The next we kenned he was running very fast towards the enemy, holding his hands over his head and crying out loud in a foreign language." It was German, said the scholarly Amos through his broken teeth. "It was German," continued Hamilton. "It seemed as if he was appealin' to the enemy to help him. But they paid no attention, and he came under fire of their machine guns. We watched him spin round like a teetotum, and kenned that he was by with it." "You are sure he was killed?" I asked. "Yes, sir. When we counter-attacked we found his body." There is a grave close by the farm of Gavrelle, and a wooden cross at its head bears the name of the Graf von Schwabing and the date of his death. The Germans took Gavrelle a little later. I am glad to think that they read that inscription. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Mr. Standfast by John Buchan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. The Summons Comes for Mr. Standfast. I slept for 1 3/4 hours that night, and when I awoke I seemed to emerge from deeps of slumber which had lasted for days. That happens sometimes after heavy fatigue and great mental strain. Even a short sleep sets up a barrier between past and present, which has to be elaborately broken down before you can link on with what has happened before. As my wits groped at the job, some drops of rain splashed on my face through the broken roof. That hurried me out of doors. It was just after dawn, and the sky was piled with thick clouds, while a wet wind blew up from the southwest. The long-prayed-for break in the weather seemed to have come at last. A deluge of rain was what I wanted, something to soak the earth and turn the roads into watercourses and clog the enemy transport, something above all to blind the enemy's eyes. For I remembered what a preposterous bluff it all had been, and what a piteous broken handful stood between the Germans and their goal. If they knew, if they only knew, they would brush us aside like flies. As I shaved, I looked back on the events of yesterday as on something that had happened long ago. I seemed to judge them impersonally, and I concluded that it had been a pretty good fight. A scratch force, half of it dog-tired and half of it untrained, had held up at least a couple of fresh divisions. But we couldn't do it again, and there were still some hours before us of desperate peril. When had the Corps said that the French would arrive? I was on the point of shouting for Hamilton to get Wake to rig up Corps headquarters when I remembered that Wake was dead. I had liked him and greatly admired him, but the recollection gave me scarcely a pang. We were all dying, and he had only gone on a stage ahead. There was no morning strafe, such as had been our usual fortune in the past week. I went out of doors and found a noiseless world under the lowering sky. The rain had stopped falling, the wind of dawn had lessened, and I feared that the storm would be delayed. I wanted it at once to help us through the next hours of tension. Was it in 6 hours that the French were coming? No, it must be 4. It couldn't be more than 4, unless somebody had made an infernal muddle. I wondered why everything was so quiet. It would be breakfast time on both sides, but there seemed no stir of man's presence in that ugly strip half a mile off. Only far back in the German hinterland I seemed to hear the rumour of traffic. An unslept and unshaven figure stood beside me, which revealed itself as Archie Roylance. "Been up all night?" he said cheerfully, lighting a cigarette. "No, I haven't had breakfast. The skipper thought we'd better get another anti-aircraft battery up this way, and I was superintending the job. He's afraid of the Hun getting over your lines and spying out the nakedness of the land. For you know we're uncommon naked, sir. Also," and Archie's face became grave, "the Hun's pouring divisions down on this sector. As I judge, he's blowing up for a thunderin' big drive on both sides of the river. Our lads yesterday said all the country back of Peronne was lousy with new troops. And he's getting his big guns forward, too. You haven't been troubled with them yet, but he has got the roads mended and a devil of a lot of new light railways, and any moment we'll have the 5.9 saying, 'Good mornin'.' Pray heaven you get relieved in time, sir. I take it there's not much risk of another push this morning." "I don't think so. The Boche took a nasty knock yesterday, and he must fancy we're pretty strong after that counter-attack. I don't think he'll strike till he can work both sides of the river, and that'll take time to prepare. That's what his fresh divisions are for. But remember, he can attack now if he likes. If he knew how weak we were, he's strong enough to send us all to glory in the next 3 hours. It's just that knowledge that you fellows have got to prevent his getting. If a single Hun plane crosses our lines and returns, we're wholly and utterly done. You've given us splendid help since the show began, Archie. For God's sake, keep it up to the finish and put every machine you can spare in the sector." "We're doing our best," he said. "We got some more fighting scouts down from the north, and we're keeping our eyes skinned. But you know as well as I do, sir, that it's never an absolute certainty. If the Hun sent over a squadron, we might beat 'em all down but one, and that one might do the trick. It's a matter of luck. The Hun's got the wind up all right in the air just now, and I don't blame the poor devil. I'm inclined to think that we haven't had the pick of his push here. Jennings says he's doing good work in Flanders, and they reckon there's a deuce of a thrust coming there pretty soon. I think we can manage the kind of footler he's been sending over here lately, but if Lench or some lad like that were to choose to turn up, I wouldn't say what might happen. The air's a big lottery," and Archie turned a dirty face skyward, where 2 of our planes were moving very high towards the east. The mention of Lench brought Peter to mind, and I asked if he had gone back. "He won't go," said Archie, "and we haven't the heart to make him. He's very happy, and he plays about with the Gladys single-seater. He's always speaking about you, sir, and it'd break his heart if we shifted him." I asked about his health, and was told that he didn't seem to have much pain. "But he's a bit queer," and Archie shook a sage head. "One of the reasons why he won't budge is because he says God has some work for him to do. He's quite serious about it, and ever since he got the notion he has perked up amazin'. He's always asking about Lench, too, not vindictive, like you understand, but quite friendly. Seems to take a sort of proprietary interest in him. I told him that Lench had had a far longer spell of first-class fightin' than anybody else, and was bound by the law of averages to be down soon, and he was quite sad about it." I had no time to worry about Peter. Archie and I swallowed breakfast, and I had a powwow with my brigadiers. By this time I had got through to Corps Headquarters and got news of the French. It was worse than I expected. General Péguy would arrive about 10 o'clock, but his men couldn't take over till well after midday. The Corps gave me their whereabouts, and I found it on the map. They had a long way to cover yet, and then there would be the slow business of relieving. I looked at my watch. There were still 6 hours before us, when the Boche might knock us to blazes, 6 hours of maddening anxiety. Lefroy announced that all was quiet on the front, and that the new wiring at the Bois de la Bruyère had been completed. Patrols had reported that, during the night, a fresh German division seemed to have relieved that which we had punished so stoutly yesterday. I asked him if he could stick it out against another attack. "No," he said without hesitation. "We're too few and too shaky on our pins to stand any more. I've only a man to every 3 yards." That impressed me, for Lefroy was usually the most devil-may-care optimist. "Curse it, there's the sun!" I heard Archie cry. It was true, for the clouds were rolling back, and the centre of the heavens was a patch of blue. The storm was coming, I could smell it in the air, but probably it wouldn't break till the evening. Where, I wondered, would we be by that time? It was now 9 o'clock, and I was keeping tight hold on myself, for I saw that I was going to have hell for the next hours. I am a pretty stolid fellow in some ways, but I have always found patience and standing still the most difficult job to tackle, and my nerves were all tattered from the long strain of the retreat. I went up to the line and saw the battalion commanders. Everything was unwholesomely quiet there. Then I came back to my headquarters to study the reports that were coming in from the air patrols. They all said the same thing. abnormal activity in the German back areas. Things seemed shaping for a new 21st of March, and if our luck were out, my poor little remnant would have to take the shock. I telephoned to the Corps and found them as nervous as me. I gave them the details of my strength and heard an agonized whistle at the other end of the line. I was rather glad that I had companions in the same purgatory. I found I couldn't sit still. If there had been any work to do, I would have buried myself in it, but there was none, only this fearsome job of waiting. I hardly ever feel cold, but now my blood seemed to be getting thin, and I astonished my staff by putting on a British warm and buttoning up the collar. Round that derelict farm I ranged like a hungry wolf, cold at the feet, queasy in the stomach, and mortally edgy in the mind. Then suddenly the cloud lifted from me, and the blood seemed to run naturally in my veins. I experienced the change of mood which a man feels sometimes when his whole being is fined down and clarified by long endurance. The fight of yesterday revealed itself as something rather splendid. What risks we had run, and how gallantly we had met them! My heart warmed as I thought of that old division of mine, those ragged veterans that were never beaten as long as breath was left in them. And the Americans, and the boys from the machine-gun school, and all the oddments we had commandeered, and old Blenkiron raging like a good-tempered lion. It was against reason that such fortitude shouldn't win out. We had snarled round and bitten the Boche so badly that he wanted no more for a little. He would come again, but presently we should be relieved, and the gallant bluecoats, fresh as paint and burning for revenge, would be there to worry him. I had no new facts on which to base my optimism, only a changed point of view, and with it came a recollection of other things. Wake's death had left me numb before, but now the thought of it gave me a sharp pang. He was the first of our little confederacy to go, but what an ending he had made, and how happy he had been in that mad time when he had come down from his pedestal and become one of the crowd. He had found himself at last, and who could grudge him such happiness? If the best were to be taken, he would be chosen first, for he was a big man before whom I uncovered my head. The thought of him made me very humble. I had never had his troubles to face, but he had come clean through them and reached a courage which was for ever beyond me. He was the faithful among us pilgrims who had finished his journey before the rest. Mary had foreseen it. There is a price to be paid, she had said, the best of us. And at the thought of Mary, a flight of warm and happy hopes seemed to settle on my mind. I was looking again beyond the war to that peace which she and I would some day inherit. I had a vision of a green English landscape, with its far-flung sense of wood and meadow and garden, and that face of all my dreams, with the eyes so childlike and brave and honest, as if they too saw beyond the dark to a radiant country. A line of an old song, which had been a favourite of my father's, sang itself in my ears. There's an eye that ever weeps, and a fair face will be fain, when I ride through Annan Water with my bonny bands again. We were standing by the crumbling rails of what had once been the farm sheepfold. I looked at Archie, and he smiled back at me, for he saw that my face had changed. Then he turned his eyes to the billowing clouds. I felt my arm clutched. "Look there," said a fierce voice, and his glasses were turned upward. I looked, and far up in the sky saw a thing like a wedge of wild geese flying towards us from the enemy's country. I made out the small dots which composed it, and my glass told me that they were planes. But only Archie's practised eye knew that they were enemy. "Boche?" I asked. "Boche," he said. "My God, we're for it now." My heart had sunk like a stone, but I was fairly cool. I looked at my watch and saw that it was 10 minutes to 11. "How many?" "5," said Archie, "or there may be 6, not more." "Listen," I said, "get on to your headquarters. Tell them that it's all up with us if a single plane gets back. Let them get well over the line, the deeper in the better, and tell them to send up every machine they possess and down them all. Tell them it's life or death. Not one single plane goes back. Quick!" Archie disappeared, and as he went our anti-aircraft guns broke out. The formation above opened and zigzagged, but they were too high to be in much danger. But they were not too high to see that which we must keep hidden or perish. The roar of our batteries died down as the invaders passed westward. As I watched their progress they seemed to be dropping lower. Then they rose again, and a bank of cloud concealed them. I had a horrid certainty that they must beat us, that some at any rate would get back. They had seen thin lines and the roads behind us empty of supports. They would see, as they advanced, the blue columns of the French coming up from the southwest, and they would return and tell the enemy that a blow now would open the road to Amiens and the sea. He had plenty of strength for it, and presently he would have overwhelming strength. It only needed a spear point to burst a jerry-built dam and let the flood through. They would return in 20 minutes, and by noon we would be broken, unless the miracle of miracles happened and they never returned. Archie reported that his skipper would do his damnedest, and that our machines were now going up. "We've a chance, sir," he said, "a good sportin' chance." It was a new Archie, with a hard voice, a lean face, and very old eyes. Behind the jagged walls of the farm buildings was a knoll, which had once formed part of the high road. I went up there alone, for I didn't want anybody near me. I wanted a viewpoint, and I wanted quiet, for I had a grim time before me. From that knoll I had a big prospect of country. I looked east to our lines, on which an occasional shell was falling, and where I could hear the chatter of machine guns. West there was peace, for the woods closed down on the landscape. Up to the north, I remember, there was a big glare as from a burning dump, and heavy guns seemed to be at work in the Ancre valley. Down in the south there was the dull murmur of a great battle, but just around me in the gap, the deadliest place of all, there was an odd quiet. I could pick out clearly the different sounds. Somebody down at the farm had made a joke, and there was a short burst of laughter. I envied the humorist his composure. There was the clatter and jingle from a battery changing position. On the road a tractor was jolting along. I could hear its driver shout, and the screech of its unoiled axle. My eyes were glued to my glasses, but they shook in my hands so that I could scarcely see. I bit my lip to steady myself, but they still wavered. From time to time I glanced at my watch. 8 minutes gone. 10. 17. If only the planes would come into sight. Even the certainty of failure would be better than this harrowing doubt. They should be back by now, unless they had swung north across the salient, or unless the miracle of miracles. Then came the distant yapping of an anti-aircraft gun, caught up the next second by others, while smoke patches studded the distant blue sky. The clouds were banking in mid-heaven, but to the west there was a big clear space, now woolly with shrapnel bursts. I counted them mechanically, 1, 3, 5, 9, with despair beginning to take the place of my anxiety. My hands were steady now, and through the glasses I saw the enemy. 5 attenuated shapes rode high above the bombardment, now sharp against the blue, now lost in a film of vapour. They were coming back, serenely, contemptuously, having seen all they wanted. The quiet was gone now, and the din was monstrous. Anti-aircraft guns, singly and in groups, were firing from every side. As I watched, it seemed a futile waste of ammunition. The enemy didn't give a tinker's curse for it. But surely there was one down. I could only count 4 now. No, there was the 5th coming out of a cloud. In 10 minutes they would be all over the line. I fairly stamped in my vexation. Those guns were no more use than a sick headache. Oh, where in God's name were our own planes? At that moment they came, streaking down into sight, 4 fighting scouts with the sun glinting on their wings and burnishing their metal cowls. I saw clearly the rings of red, white, and blue. Before their downward drive, the enemy instantly spread out. I was watching with bare eyes now, and I wanted companionship, for the time of waiting was over. Automatically I must have run down the knoll, for the next I knew I was staring at the heavens with Archie by my side. The combatants seemed to couple instinctively. Diving, wheeling, climbing, a pair would drop out of the melee or disappear behind a cloud. Even at that height I could hear the methodical rat-tat-tat of the machine guns. Then there was a sudden flare and wisp of smoke. A plane sank, turning and twisting, to earth. "Hun," said Archie, who had his glasses on it. Almost immediately another followed. This time the pilot recovered himself while still 1,000 feet from the ground and started gliding for the enemy lines. Then he wavered, plunged sickeningly, and fell headlong into the wood behind La Bruyere. Farther east, almost over the front trenches, a 2-seater Albatross and a British pilot were having a desperate tussle. The bombardment had stopped, and from where we stood every movement could be followed. First one, then another climbed uppermost and dived back, swooped out and wheeled in again, so that the two planes seemed to clear each other only by inches. Then it looked as if they closed and interlocked. I expected to see both go crashing, when suddenly the wings of one seemed to shrivel up, and the machine dropped like a stone. "Hun," said Archie, "that makes 3. Oh, good lads, good lads!" Then I saw something which took away my breath. Sloping down in wide circles came a German machine, and following, a little behind and a little above, a British. It was the first surrender in mid-air I had seen. In my amazement I watched the couple right down to the ground, till the enemy landed in a big meadow across the high road, and our own men in a field nearer the river. When I looked back into the sky, it was bare. North, south, east and west, there was not a sign of aircraft, British or German. A violent trembling took me. Archie was sweeping the heavens with his glasses and muttering to himself, where was the fifth man? He must have fought his way through, and it was too late. But was it? From the toe of a great rolling cloud bank a flame shot earthwards, followed by a V-shaped trail of smoke. British or Boche? British or Boche? I didn't wait long for an answer, for riding over the far end of the cloud came 2 of our fighting scouts. I tried to be cool and snapped my glasses into their case, though the reaction made me want to shout. Archie turned to me with a nervous smile and a quivering mouth. "I think we have won on the post," he said. He reached out a hand for mine, his eyes still on the sky, and I was grasping it when it was torn away. He was staring upwards with a white face. We were looking at the 6th enemy plane. It had been behind the others and much lower, and was making straight at great speed for the east. The glasses showed me a different type of machine, a big machine with short wings, which looked menacing as a hawk in a covey of grouse. It was under the cloud bank, and above, satisfied, easing down after their fight, and unwitting of this enemy, rode the 2 British craft. A neighbouring anti-aircraft gun broke out into a sudden burst, and I thanked heaven for its inspiration. Curious as to this new development, the 2 British turned, caught sight of the Boche, and dived for him. What happened in the next minutes I cannot tell. The 3 seemed to be mixed up in a dogfight, so that I could not distinguish friend from foe. My hands no longer trembled. I was too desperate. The patter of machine guns came down to us, and then one of the 3 broke clear and began to climb. The others strained to follow, but in a second he had risen beyond their fire, for he had easily the pace of them. Was it the Hun? Archie's dry lips were talking. "It's Lensch," he said. "How do you know?" I gasped angrily. "Can't mistake him. Look at the way he slipped out as he banked. That's his patent trick." In that agonizing moment hope died in me. I was perfectly calm now, for the time for anxiety had gone. Farther and farther drifted the British pilots behind, while Lensch, in the completeness of his triumph, looped more than once as if to cry an insulting farewell. In less than 3 minutes he would be safe inside his own lines, and he carried the knowledge which for us was death. Someone was bawling in my ear and pointing upward. It was Archie, and his face was wild. I looked and gasped, seized my glasses and looked again. A second before, Lensch had been alone. Now there were two machines. I heard Archie's voice. "My God, it's the Gladys, the little Gladys." His fingers were digging into my arm and his face was against my shoulder. And then his excitement sobered into an awe which choked his speech as he stammered, It's old." But I did not need him to tell me the name, for I had divined it when I first saw the new plane drop from the clouds. I had that queer sense that comes sometimes to a man, that a friend is present when he cannot see him. Somewhere up in the void 2 heroes were fighting their last battle, and one of them had a crippled leg. I had never any doubt about the result, though Archie told me later that he went crazy with suspense. Lensch was not aware of his opponent till he was almost upon him, and I wonder if by any freak of instinct he recognized his greatest antagonist. He never fired a shot, nor did Peter. I saw the German twist and side-slip as if to baffle the fate descending upon him. I saw Peter veer over vertically, and I knew that the end had come. He was there to make certain of victory, and he took the only way. The machines closed. There was a crash which I felt, though I could not hear it, and the next second both were hurtling down, over and over, to the earth. They fell in the river just short of the enemy lines, but I did not see them, for my eyes were blinded, and I was on my knees. After that it was all a dream. I found myself being embraced by a French general of division, and saw the first companies of the cheerful bluecoats whom I had longed for. With them came the rain, and it was under a weeping April sky that early in the night I marched what was left of my division away from the battlefield. The enemy guns were starting to speak behind us, but I did not heed them. I knew that now there were warders at the gate, and I believed that by the grace of God that gate was barred forever. They took Peter from the wreckage with scarcely a scar except his twisted leg. Death had smoothed out some of the age in him and left his face much as I remembered it long ago in the Mashonaland hills. In his pocket was his old battered Pilgrim's Progress. It lies before me as I write, and beside it, for I was his only legatee, the little case which came to him weeks later, containing the highest honour that can be bestowed upon a soldier of Britain. It was from the Pilgrim's Progress that I read next morning, when, in the lee of an apple orchard, Mary and Blenkiron and I stood, in the soft spring rain, beside his grave. And what I read was the tale in the end, not of Mr. Standfast, whom he had singled out for his counterpart, but of Mr. Valiant for truth, whom he had not hoped to emulate. I set down the words as a salute and a farewell. Then said he, I am going to my father's, and though with great difficulty I am got hither, yet now I do not repent me of all the trouble I have been at to arrive where I am. My sword I give to him that shall succeed me in my pilgrimage, and my courage and skill to him that can get it. My marks and scars I carry with me, to be a witness for me that I have fought his battles, who now will be my rewarder. So he passed over, and all the trumpets sounded for him